Planes full of toxic stuff, explosives, miles of rock and barbed wire fences, armies of thousands, snipers and helicopters. For centuries, Australia has been at war. The war waged against animals. Today, you'll learn which birds in Australia have been hunted with machine guns, what the mouse plague is, which animal can destroy more living creatures than the Australian wildfires, and why red foxes might as well become Australia's most dangerous animals. When you're a kid and get a rabbit for Christmas, this sounds like a great gift. If it's not just one rabbit, but 24 at once, then, well, you can breed them, which is not too bad either. But what seemed like an innocent Christmas gift of 24 rabbits in 1859 became the most devastating biological invasion of Australia, according to a recent study. It all started with a wealthy settler, Thomas Austin, who brought 24 wild rabbits to his estate in Melbourne. Some reports say he wanted to hunt them, others to breed them. Whatever the case, the rabbits multiplied like crazy. Austin allowed them to roam freely on the estate, and the animals took advantage of such great conditions. Over the next 3 years, the population of rabbits grew exponentially from 24 to thousands as they continued to multiply. 50 years later, the rich man's cute pets spread across the continent. This photo was taken in 1938. Yes, that's a lot of rabbits. This event resulted in a disaster in Australia. Rabbits showed the highest rate of colonization for introduced mammals ever recorded. It's worth saying that Austin wasn't the first person to bring rabbits to Australia. 5 rabbits were aboard the first fleet of British ships that arrived in Sydney in 1788. And over the next 70 years, people brought at least 90 more. But it was the descendants of those same 24 rabbits that ended up dominating the continent. But why is that even an issue in the first place? I mean, well, if you've seen rabbits, they're adorable and seemingly harmless. Well, first of all, rabbits are an invasive species for Australia, and invasive species are almost always harmful to any established ecosystem. And second, these cute and harmless rabbits destroy crops, so much so that it leads to soil erosion. Not only have rabbits damaged Australia's cropland, but they've also contributed to the extinction of native plant and animal species. Not on purpose, of course. They don't look like creatures capable of evil. However, in terms of genetics, the rabbits descended from Austin's pets turned out to be the real villains. Well, or at least very well adapted to surviving in the wild. Unlike other Australian rabbits that exhibited traits like tameness, floppy ears, and fancy-colored fur, rabbits descended from Austin's brood had a large number of wild ancestors. The genes of those ancestors taught them how to avoid predators and survive in a challenging environment. Also, these rabbits proved to be very adaptable. All they needed to live was the right soil to dig burrows and short grass to graze. Turned out Australia had both. All that they had to do then was breed, and wild rabbits were quite good at that too. They're known for their ability to breed all year round from a fairly young age. Just imagine, more than 4 litters a year with up to 5 baby rabbits in each. It's like a whole army. Something had to be done about this army. Government researchers, biologists, farmers, and many others tried to get rid of invasive rabbits. This is what a relatively small catch looked like after the rabbit hunt. But even that didn't impede the population in any way. The rabbits were multiplying faster than people were able to catch them. It all started with fences. What's more, the government even went ahead and commissioned the building of a fence spanning the length of Western Australia, from north to south. Unfortunately, the fence didn't do the trick. An artist of that time clearly depicted how ineffective the rabbit fence was. Farmers were also known to destroy rabbit holes in an attempt to control the population that way. It made sense. Destroying the holes left the rabbits without a place where they could safely multiply and raise their babies. But in the end, the destruction of the holes didn't work either. In the 1950s, the government turned to biocontrol. They released rabbits in southeastern Australia infected with myxoma, an acute viral disease specific to rabbits. By the way, it's believed that myxoma was the first virus to be purposely introduced into the wild to eradicate animals. And while this virus did cause many rabbits in Australia to die, they eventually just developed immunity. Again, it didn't work. People had to come up with something else. This is the footage of toxic bait being loaded onto an airplane for rabbits. It was filmed in 1965. And here the rabbits are, yes, being blown up. People in Australia have really tried everything they could come up with. Eventually, people managed to find a solution. The rabbits were defeated by hemorrhagic disease virus, which was transmitted by flies and killed rabbits 48 hours after infection. Scientists utilized the virus in 1996, and it soon wiped out 90% of the rabbit population in arid regions. This chart clearly shows how the rabbit population has changed over the past 100 years. Each sharp decline matches a time when humans used a new method of control. Alas, since flies are the ones who carried the virus, the disease didn't affect rabbits that lived in cooler and wetter regions. In addition, over time, rabbits began to develop resistance to this pathogen as well. Well, what did it all lead to? The colonization of Australia by wild rabbits is one of the most well-known and devastating biological invasions in human history. Despite all human attempts to somehow deal with the rabbit infestation, there are about 200 million feral rabbits in Australia today. They still threaten about 300 plant and animal species and cost the economy $200 million in agricultural damage each year. The idea of rabbits taking over Australia is both scary and bizarre. But there's also this phenomenon called a mouse plague that's equally unsettling and strange. A couple of years ago, on their way back to their home after a long trip, a family of farmers suddenly saw a lot of white spots on the dark roadway. The farmers soon realized it was mice. Upon reaching their home, they discovered that it had become uninhabitable. The mice had chewed their way into the pantry and ruined all the food they could reach. Look at that! Here are mouse feces lying right on the kitchen floor. The whole bed is covered in it too. And here's a nasty surprise under the blanket. The rodents even chewed through the insulation around the engine wiring in 2 tractors and ruined the hay bales. The house was in such disrepair that the couple had to sleep in their camper. And even 6 months after they got back, they were still cleaning up the mess. But the worst part is that this family is not the only one which suffered mice infestation. According to a 2021 article, Eastern Australia is actually experiencing one of the worst mouse plagues in human history. Mice have reportedly been biting people in hospital beds. The population of one prison had to be relocated after mice chewed through the facility's electrical infrastructure. We found reports of these furry pests running around school classrooms. And farmers fear the damage to crops will exceed $1 billion Australian dollars. Here, the mice chewed through the threads that bind the hay in the bales. And in March 2021, mice were stripping food and other items off the shelves of a supermarket near Sydney. But people began to fear for their health for real when mice killed by poison baits were found in drinking water tanks. Yes, to address rodent problems, people employ baits, resulting in an abundance of dead mice that spread across the ground, looking like some sort of carpet. Homeowners who set traps reported catching 500 to 600 mice a night. You get it, right? That's how many mice one could harvest in just one night. Now imagine how many rodents are actually out there if that's just the ones you managed to catch in a short period of time. But as awful as it sounds, mouse plagues aren't something Australia has never seen before. If we look at the data from the 1900s, it becomes clear. Similar outbreaks occur in different regions every 4 to 5 years. However, the 2021 plague seems to be the worst one on record. The main reason for that is believed to be the abundance of food after a warm and humid summer. After several years of severe drought, culminating in the devastating wildfires of 2019-2020, Eastern Australia had plenty of rainfall for most of 2020, especially in agricultural areas. Mice seem to have taken advantage of the situation to multiply at a frightening rate. Scientists have even estimated that when mice gather around food sources during the plague, their population can reach densities as high as 3,000 mice per hectare. And that's given that mice are actually an invasive species too. They most likely arrived in Australia as stowaways aboard the first fleet of British colonists in 1788. The rodents needed some time to settle in a new place, and in 1871 the first mouse plague occurred. It was localized, but by 1917 a much larger plague had occurred, and they've been occurring more often since then. Needless to say, this begs the question: if people couldn't handle rabbits, can we at least stop mice? Well, there is, in fact, a way. All you have to do is stop growing wheat completely and the mouse plague outbreaks will stop. But try suggesting that to the Australian government. They'll laugh at you, and it's not hard to see why. Growing food is too important for our survival. And since mice eat the same food too, well, it looks like Australia is stuck in this loop for a very, very long time. But you know what sounds even stranger than Australia stuck in a mouse plague loop? The fact that Australia declared war on the emu in 1932. No, really. Soldiers with machine guns were deployed to fight the flightless birds. But what did the emu do to deserve that? Well, it all started after the Great Depression. Farmers in Western Australia were having a tough time with their crops, and things only got worse with the arrival of some 20,000 emus. These birds were protected as a native species until 1922, but after that they were classified as vermin. The behavior of the emus didn't change in any way. They migrated from coastal areas inland every year, each time for the purpose of breeding. But then the 20,000 birds suddenly realized that the newly cultivated farmland was a great place to feed and raise their offspring. This really looks like a good place for that, but just check this out. It looks like the area was damaged by locusts or fire, but it was actually the emus that did it. The farmers were clearly unhappy that their wheat crops were being destroyed. In addition, the emus were damaging the fences set up to fend off the rabbits. Yes, the rabbit infestation was happening at the same time. Being an Australian farmer is sure hard. That's how many emus gathered near the rabbit fence. No wonder they became an issue. Eventually, the farmers asked the government for help, and since many farmers were former World War I soldiers, they asked for permission to use machine guns. A real army went to war with the emu. During the first 6 days of the war, 2,500 rounds were fired. The emu didn't incur substantial losses despite being shot multiple times. The number of birds killed is unclear. One report indicates only 50 birds, while others put this figure at 200 to 500. The military noted that the birds managed to escape even with severe wounds. Keep in mind, they actually fired guns like this, and still the emus survived. Here's how Major Meredith spoke of his opponents. If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it'd face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. But you know what the best part is? People hardened by World War I went to war with emus and lost. Lots of ammo was wasted, vehicles were constantly breaking down, weapons were jamming. Eventually, after 38 days of intense fighting, the army was asked to call off the Great Emu War. Instead, the Australian government decided to supply farmers with free ammunition as needed to handle the emu problem. They offered rewards for every emu killed, along with a promise to construct a protective wall spanning 124 miles to shield the farmers. Spoiler alert, the wall was never built. Turns out that it was the emu who emerged victorious in the war in 1932. These birds are still found in large numbers in Australia, and the story of their confrontation with humans is worthy of being adapted into a film. But hold on, because the confrontations between Australians and animals don't stop there. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that's just the beginning. We also got camels thrown into the mix. You don't really associate camels with Australia. Believe it or not, Australia boasts the highest count of wild camels worldwide, and we're talking about thousands of them striding across the country. But this was not always the case. Camels were not native to Australia, but were brought here by the British settlers from India and Afghanistan in the 19th century. Actually, such a decision was quite logical. One had to have a suitable means of transportation to move across the continent with many arid and desert areas. Camels did an excellent job. With their help, people were able to venture on expeditions to the farthest corners of the continent. This illustration from the book shows one such expedition. The book was published in 1873. And these camel trains helped people carry goods through hard-to-reach places. Yes, that's what this mode of transportation was actually called, camel trains. This camel holds the record for traveling 600 miles without water. The photo was captured back in 1895, and just the idea of undertaking such a long journey without water makes me thirsty. Overall, camels were a popular mode of transport. They were brought to Australia in huge numbers. It's estimated that at least 15,000 camels arrived in Australia between 1870 and 1900. They were used for literally everything that involved traveling or transporting goods. Here's a photo that was taken in 1928. a camel train helps move an entire building. But times were changing, and by the early 20th century, automobile transportation was becoming more and more popular. Keeping camels that weren't used was too expensive, and many owners began simply letting them go. Perhaps some other animals would have simply died in the Australian climate or managed to barely adapt, except that everything worked out perfectly for the camels. They literally found their place in life and multiplied, turning into a large population that still exists today. Although their impact on the environment is not as severe compared to other pests introduced to Australia, camels eat over 80% of the available plant species. They pollute water bodies, contribute to soil erosion, damage fences, and drinkers for cattle. It's hard to believe that such destruction could be caused by a camel and not by some angry rhino who got into a fight with a tipsy elephant. But yeah, it was a camel that did it. Among other things, camels damage infrastructure, such as faucets, pumps, and toilets, because they perceive them as a source of water. They can smell water up to 3 miles away and are even attracted to the moisture condensed by air conditioners. This drinker here is intended for livestock, and yet wild camels drink from it too. The camels drink a huge amount of water not meant for them, up to 53 gallons in a few minutes, and destroy the infrastructure to find even more sources of water. Eventually, Australia declared camels vermin and now treats them as an invasive species whose spread needs to be stopped urgently. Culling programs have been launched randomly over the years. Most often it's aerial culling, that is, snipers from helicopters simply shoot the animals down. Camel carcasses are left to lie in the sun and decompose. Can you imagine the air temperature in Australia? It's been estimated that by 2012, about 75,000 camels were being killed each year in Australia. And yet, as of 2020, Australia still has the largest number of wild camels, with an estimated population of about 300,000. Now check this out. This industrial refrigerator is filled with camel carcasses, which will basically become delicious and nutritious food in the future. So why not simply eat all the invasive camels? I get that it seems harsh, but if we have to shoot down the animals, we should at least make sure the meat won't go to waste, don't you think? In fact, people who cull camels are even getting inquiries from other countries. Many want to buy camel meat. Several obstacles, including logistical issues and high costs, have prevented trading from taking place thus far. Generally speaking, the idea of eating invasive species as a means of controlling them has become popular in the last decade. The logic is pretty simple. Just as people used to eat some native animal species before they went extinct, they could probably do the same with pests. That's what they're doing in Florida, catching invasive lionfish and then serving them up in restaurants. But building an economy on wild species is risky. The more animals you kill, the harder it is to do it, because you just run out of them. And that essentially causes supply issues. There are projects and facilities in Australia that use invasive species for cooking, but there are too few of them to solve the problem. For example, these olives are grown on wild trees that have spread uncontrollably through Australia. Oil is made from them, and it helps stop the invasion. And here's a dish served in a Melbourne restaurant. It's made with invasive sea urchins. But all this isn't enough to deal with the species taking over Australia anyway. Generally speaking, when you think about it, there are so many human-introduced species in Australia, it can blow one's mind. And some of them are completely unexpected. For example, the most devastating species is probably the red fox. Since European settlement, mainland Australia has lost at least 20 mammal species, far more than any other country in the same time period. All we have left of these animals are just illustrations. In the vast areas of southern mainland Australia, there are simply no native medium-sized mammals left, only limitless numbers of foxes and rabbits. Were the red foxes the only ones responsible for this extinction, or did they have accomplices? I don't mean other predators, but some other factors. Well, they may have had some role to play, but all research suggests that red foxes were the main cause of many extinctions. Remember rabbits? One might wonder, why wouldn't foxes hunt them? Oh, they did, and they still keep doing that. Here's a fox catching an invasive rabbit, but it doesn't do people any good at all. Since there are a lot of rabbits, it means that the foxes will always be provided with food, and they'll continue to multiply. Unfortunately, no amount of rabbits will keep these predators from hunting lambs and poultry either. Defenseless lambs are a favorite food of foxes that sneak into farms. Turns out that the environmental and agricultural impact of red foxes and the effort that goes into trying to reduce that impact is costing Australia more than $200 million a year. And guess what? People are also to blame for the introduction of red foxes in Australia. I mean, these animals didn't sneak onto ships, they were brought here on purpose. Victorian settlers eager to indulge the noble sport of fox hunting have brought in and released these animals here many times since the 1840s. All these people were members of Australian hunting clubs. They just wanted to entertain themselves and had no idea how serious a problem they would create for their descendants. For several decades, foxes didn't take off in Australia until 1874. Boom! Their population began to skyrocket, and the red foxes soon spread across the country like wildfire. Typically, it's incredibly challenging to undo the colonization of an area by any species. I mean, there are some options, but they're quite limited. You've already realized that they almost never work. However, do you know what would happen if, by some miracle, Australia managed to exterminate the red foxes? The country would be dominated by cats. Over 230 years since they appeared on the continent, feral cats have wiped out more than a dozen species that had lived alongside humans for thousands of years. Other species have been pushed to the brink of extinction, also because of the cats. Cats arrived in Australia with the first European settlers in 1788, and then within 70 years spread across the country. Cats now inhabit almost all of Australia. On average, about 2.8 million feral cats roam the continent, but experts say that number could rise to 5.6 million. Every year, each individual feral cat in Australia kills 390 mammals, 225 reptiles, and 130 birds. Keep in mind, there are many cats out there. Native Australian wildlife faces a staggering threat as cats alone eliminate around 1.4 billion animals in Australia annually, a number comparable to the tragic toll inflicted by the catastrophic wildfires of 2019-2020. Remarkably, these feline predators achieve this without the use of fire, relying solely on their cute faces and soft paws. This cat caught a major Mitchell's cockatoo, a rare bird that's an endangered species in Australia. And no, the cat's not bothered by that fact. As you've realized now, Australia is constantly plagued by various invasive species. According to the Australian Museum, more than 3,000 non-native species have arrived to the continent's shores since 1770. These include mammals, birds, plants, insects, and other invertebrates, fungi, parasites, and sea creatures. They are found all over Australia, with some feeling so great in their new home that many people don't realize that the plant they so carefully water or the bird they throw crumbs to is actually an undesired invasive species. Actually, the issue of invasive animals in Australia is so acute that it was even covered in an episode of The Simpsons where Bart releases one frog and it ends up turning into an entire invasion. For well over a century, Australians have been grappling with invasive species through desperate means, even resorting to introducing similarly invasive predators. However, all their efforts have proven futile. Australia is certainly not the only country with invasive creatures, but its biodiversity is unique and distinctive, shaped by millions of years of isolation, and much of the wildlife is endemic. That is, it doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet. In addition, Australia's top predators are long since extinct. This gives invasive species more opportunities to thrive. There's warmth, water, and food, yet nothing to threaten them. The Tasmanian tiger, the marsupial lion, and the megalania, a lizard that could weigh 4,300 pounds, were the continent's formidable predators that went extinct. The only remaining top predator, the dingo, is threatened by humans. Dingoes love hunting sheep, and farmers are not happy about it. Wildlife officials have tried many different ways to combat invasive species. You already know their methods: viruses, poisons, huge fences, and even machine guns with snipers. In one famous case, an attempt to solve one problem led to another. The cane toad was introduced in 1935 to hunt sugarcane-eating beetles, but it turned out to be a disastrous failure because the toads couldn't climb up this very cane to reach the insects, And instead of helping humans, they just multiplied and became an invasive species themselves, threatening the Australian fauna. If you've been watching our videos for a while, though, you know this story. But does Australia have any chance of dealing with invasive species? Honestly, all of the existing ways of control seem to be, well, not very effective. Unless scientists come up with something particularly crafty in the future, something that involves genetics. Wait, what if they have already come up with something like that? Okay, we need more data. Steve and I will try and find it. Stay tuned and see you later.